about Jorinde Voigt, Blueprints for Nothing. He tells me his presentation is exactly 15 minutes long, so if you have questions, you'll want to talk to him afterwards. So we'll start with Stephen. Go ahead.
Okay. I want to begin with just a very brief introduction. I've written a critical piece on the German artist Jorinde Voigt. Voigt makes these very elaborate linear constructions on paper. They are drawn. I included this image here so you can see how she works actually lying the paper out on the floor. When you see some of the images in the slideshow, it will seem as if they're computer generated, but they aren't. She actually does make these. Her sources are quite varied and quite interesting. She does a lot of work with mathematical algorithms, musical scores, literature, philosophy, language systems. I also mentioned that she's a conceptual artist. The definition of conceptual art, loosely speaking, is art which draws special attention to an idea or a mental process. Sometimes it's defined as art for which the idea is more important than the art object itself. So you could possibly argue that her drawings are not conceptual in that pure of a sense, but I want to talk about it in terms of conceptual art because I'm interested in the way that her drawings comment on the idea of structure. And what I mean by the idea of structure, or an idea that applies equally to all structures as opposed to any particular or practical system, will hopefully become clear as I read my paper. So the title is Jorinde Voigt, Blueprints for Nothing. The drawings of German artist Jorinde Voigt represent structures without purpose. They are, as aesthetic objects, final entities with no need of a practical outlet or referent. This warrants mentioning only because the technical purposelessness of the drawings, to quote conceptual arts founder Sol LeWitt, feels at odds with their intensely systematic, calculated appearance. Perhaps this feeling of incongruity between the non-functional artwork and the apparent functionality of its design is due to our association of strict rules with practical application, as in the case of a blueprint. In a blueprint, the particular internal relations are precise and cohesive in a way that connotes physical necessity, because in a sense the forces of gravity, etc., which act on the house also act indirectly on the blueprint via its purpose. Our idea of structure is captive to its typical but non-essential association of a design and a real-world product. The blueprint is a drawing whose structural meaning is determined by the hidden presence of a real house, a presence which detracts or at least distracts from the real essence of structure. That essence resides in the commonality between structures, as far from specific practical features, as far from purpose as possible. Structure itself is simply a set of rules, with or without a purpose. Jorinde Voigt has helped liberate structure from its subservient role as a descriptor of the real. Her drawings are as precise, as internally consistent as any blueprint, and yet there is no real-world product to which they correspond. Looking at them, we suddenly question our own tendency to think of the rules as a property belonging only to practical systems. The artist may indeed draw upon real-world systems as source material, especially musical scores, mathematical algorithms, and language systems. But having converted these initially practical codes into the aesthetic object of the drawing, the artwork uses them only as a source and not as a referent. That is to say, while we can account for certain properties of the drawing by recalling the symphony or the algorithm, we cannot say that the drawing is a representation per se of either. The drawing is an aesthetically driven appropriation of rules, proportions, and arrangements inspired by the successful patterns of Beethoven or Bach, but applied to no such practical end. Voigt does not describe anything, but rather draws attention to the effect of describing nothing in a highly systematic way. She promotes an aesthetic in which unadulterated structure takes full precedent, an aesthetic in which the rules themselves are the subject matter. The conceptual recourse offered by most designs, a blueprint for instance, is that our understanding may drift towards the familiar real-world product which the design describes. In the absence of such recourse, we are left with the notion of structure itself, or in the words of Jacques Derrida, with structurality. Herein lies the great achievement of Jorinde Voigt. Her drawings purify structure of its practical outlet, and what remains must belong not so much to any specific structure as to the idea of structure. In Lewitt's famous definition of conceptual art, the idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. This is a quote. The idea becomes the machine that makes art, end quote. Voigt's drawings qualify as conceptual because the exactness of their execution precludes spontaneity. They are calculated and arranged so deliberately that we cannot help but look to their cerebral origins, as per Lewitt's definition. And yet, while the internal components are strictly arranged in relation to one another, the total form seems in fact highly spontaneous. It seems, moreover, totally unaccountable. Why this overall form and not that? The huge variety of Voigt's work suggests numberless substitutions of one system for another, united only by their internal obedience to a set of rules, where each set of rules is unique to its own structure. We can intuit the reason for the size and position of any given line because it agrees with all the other lines in the total drawing. But what does the total drawing agree with? This is a little like asking, X is explained by nature, but what is nature explained by? Once we attempt to describe the reason for the whole form, once we extend our inquiry outside of the rules themselves and into the space of a higher genesis, we are without evidence. Perhaps the same could be said of any number of other systems, and particularly of Saussurean language. Saussure's structural linguistics maintains that each individual sign, each word in a language is defined not by its positive reference, but by its difference from all the other terms in the system. A term has meaning, has a function, only so far as it exists in relation to different terms with different functions. Might we say the same of Jorinde Voigt's drawings? With a figure such as horizont, each line appears to perform a positive role. Yet, as we have already established, this cannot be a referential role, since there is nothing which the drawing refers to, no transcendental signifier. What, if not a positive reference, dictates the nature of any given line? It can only be the other lines in the system, such that, as the artist constructs the drawing, each line is determined by its own, not by its own independent function, but by the composite effect of all the lines that went before it. The first line determines the second, the first and second determine the third, and so on. No element determines itself. No term retains its significance outside the systemic context. If Saussure's revelation was that the terms of a system have systemic and not referential meaning, Voigt has merely rendered this fact more obvious by removing reference as a possibility. The system is all that remains, and so of course its elements must refer back to itself. But Voigt's work also moves beyond Saussure in the whole structuralist project, which is the project of discovering universal structures through their particular instances. To understand this point better, we will borrow Saussure's terminology of langue and parole. Langue designates the universal or common structure of language, while parole designates an individual utterance. Parole in a structuralist analysis is used to reveal the greater langue. Think then of horizont as being a total structure, the langue and its specific lines or elements as the parole. A specific line acts like an uncommonly self-conscious parole. Stripped of the illusion of positive reference, it easily yields up its systemic differential identity. Voigt's drawings, because they are reduced to the most basic forms and relations, and because they lack outside reference, are structurally transparent, and thus far in the service of structuralist claims. The reason her work exceeds those claims is that collectively it suggests the coexistence of multiple self-sufficient structures. The sheer number of viable langue, represented by the capricious variety in Voigt's portfolio, contradicts the notion of a universal, stable, and permanent superstructure. We return then to the problem of total form. Structuralism hopes to analyze specific expressions and thereby identify a single form common to all of them. If this were achieved, and historically it has not been, there would be no such question as why this totality as opposed to that, since the totality of superstructure which existed would be the one which made sense out of all the given evidence. But when multiple sets of evidence appear, multiple independent totalities appear with them. The implication which ensues is the relativity of truth. This is dedicated to Mark Henberg, by the way, to the system in which it is located. And this is the central interest of postmodernism. Recall that in horizon, it was possible to account for any line by referring to the other lines in the same system, such that each is relative to each other into the total form. Line X is such because lines Y and Z are such, and they must all add up to a cohesive whole. But this explanation cannot account for the whole itself, and Derrida's thesis of the center may help us understand why. In his famous essay, Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, Derrida identifies the awareness of structurality, an awareness cultivated by Voigt's non-referential drawings as a historical phenomenon. Derrida writes that, quote, structure, or rather the structurality of structure, although it has always been involved, has always been neutralized or reduced, and this by the process of giving it a center or referring it to a point of presence, a fixed origin. The function of this center was not only to orient, balance, and organize the structure, but above all to limit what we might call the free play of the structure. This principle of origin, that which limits free play, may be the closest possible description for the force behind one of Voigt's constructions. It is a force which determines the appearance of the structure, that is, orients, balances, and organizes the structure, while being at the same time unaccountable in those same terms. This because whatever determines the grammar of the system must be outside that system, or else it would be itself determined by itself, a kind of logical black hole. If we follow Derrida in calling this force the center, then it is that which, quote, governs the structure while escaping structurality. By instinctively accepting the authority of this center, we are able to, quote, conceive of structure from the basis of a full presence which is out of play. To answer the riddle, why this total form and not that, is in a way impossible, since it assumes an understanding of the center, when the only evidence we have of the center is its structure. And this is precisely what the center escapes. Moreover, the wide variety of possible centers implied by the variety of Voigt's work indicates that no center is privileged or permanent, as structuralism would have it be. Instead, what we see in the portfolio of this remarkable artist is, as Derrida says, a series of substitutions of center for center, as a linked chain of determinations of the center. Finally, the radical implication of Voigt's work becomes clear. That in relation to the elements of that the relation of elements in a system is only natural and consistent within the limits of that system. What seems intuitive, coherent, and inevitable about a set of relations only seems that way under the dictations of a particular center, a center which is itself not intuitive, not coherent, not inevitable. It is, on the contrary, one of many possible centers, each of which projects a set of relations as internally consistent as any other. The notion of a single, stable, discoverable metaphysics quavers in the wake of this revelation. If the same could be said of other structures, social, cultural, theological, then these lose their claim to permanence and are replaced by mutable understandings brought on by the succession of centers. Voigt's drawings are in the tradition of Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Derrida in contradicting the notion of a singular metaphysics. For a thing to be true, it must be consistent with a set of known rules. Change the rules, and the truth changes with it. Voigt's drawings portray the self-sufficiency of countless alternative structures and suggest that one truth, that the one truth and the one reality are just that, one of many. In conclusion, I would like to thank Garth Clausen for supervising the project. And once again, if you have questions, I assume we're out of time.
I think we have time for a few questions.
Okay.
Sure. Question. I'll show my ignorance, perhaps, but is the artist commercially successful? Is this?
Yes, extremely so. If you look up pictures of her house, you can get a sense of exactly how commercially successful she's been. But yeah, she's very much a big name in the German art world, less so here.
What drew you to her in the first place?
I'm sorry?
What drew you to her in the first place?
I think, well, personally, my taste in art very much inclined towards line and linear dominated drawings. I think, who was it? Yves Klein, who was a colorist, who made these solid color blocks, like that color had been interrupted in the history of art by the cowardly line. I feel just the opposite. I think line is interrupted and pushed out by other things. So I like the fact that she's entirely reliant on the line, and I think there's sort of a number of fascinating contradictions that sort of hover around her work. It's very, very difficult to try and understand. That's what attracted me to it.
So let me just see this so that like I've gotten what you're saying. So basically you're saying, one of the things that you're saying is that one of the reasons why this piece is interesting is because of the tension between the lack of the aesthetic appeal, almost turning to a purely functional object, but at the same time what it serves no function whatsoever. So that tension itself causes it to be an interesting work of art. That is correct, right?
Right, that's correct.
So these are internally coherent works of art which do not really signify anything in the material world. Okay, so I'm not a raving lunatic. Okay, so then don't you think that this is just a logical step forward from machine art? So basically a human doing machine art or machine assisted art? Like you've no doubt seen people putting pencils on pendulums and throwing them away. And
yeah. Oh yeah, certainly. And when I talk about them in terms of structures, other critics use other words for them. Apparatuses and machines certainly seems like one that would work as well. Good time?
yeah.
Right.
Maybe one more?
Yeah, I just, something I never actually thought to ask you, Stephen, is when and where did you first encounter her? Because she's not that well known in this country.
She's not. As I recall, I saw her in one of like the small, very back ads in art form in a space that was about that big. I just chanced across it. It was like the equivalent of like those really tawdry, cheap commercials that get pushed to the very back of the magazine. But I saw that tiny little image and immediately looked her up.
Thank you, Stephen. Very good.